know the authentication scenario. We are going to authenticate subjects versus objects and vice versa. We are going to authenticate objects versus subjects and so on. Object and subject, they are context of user and resources. So a user can reach a resource because he's authenticated, and the resource might be utilized by user since he is authenticated. We see the scenarios and technologies applied to authenticate. No, Ahmed, did not hear you. Did you say something? Write the text if you are not able to speak. Write a message.
لا خلاص أقول لك إن الشباب.
Yeah, clear, Ahmed, don't worry. Good. So there are technologies behind the application of the authentication. It's not arbitrary or by hazard. There are technologies we are going to follow, via which we are governed. I may use the word. Means we are going to apply one technology that has some rules, policies, politics, behind of which we fulfill the authentication mechanism. Briefly, the overview of this chapter is a list of authentication mechanisms, starting with the main digital, let's say, authentication context. Remember that the password and the username password is one of the very famous authentication scenario. Weak, yes, and still persistent. It's one of the weak authentication mechanisms that we are able to break much more easier when compared to other authentication scenarios, but still persistent more than the others because of the ease and the less, let's say, less economically set from both sides, to the provider and to the user. Token based means you have to have something in order to be authenticated. Biometric, you have to be something in order to be authenticated. Also, remote user authentication is something to be authenticated remotely through a media, through an interface, through an API, through a hop, something like that. We're going to see the concerns versus the authentication. We are being authenticated, yes, but there are concerns. We are not able to apply this and that. We are not able to apply all of them. We are going to see the issues, the concerns regarding such behavior. We are going to define some of the authentication technologies. Here we are going to go behind the biometric systems. As per an example, the eye print or the fingerprint or the voice or the, let's say, the gait shape of the body and so on. There are we're going to see this technology. This is another point in this chapter. In addition to, we are going to see an case study versus the authentication of the users. Phase 2, the ATM, the automatic transaction machines, or the bank machines, the ATM, the withdrawal machines. Let's go further. Let's go further. These actually the main. Those are the main objectives, which are mainly going to make us understand the authentication scenario. We're going to believe and see in a real case that the username and password context is the very weak authentication mechanism and is the most persistent scenario in security. As first the developer tries to build an authentication based system, he will think of the password based authentication scenario. We are going to talk about the token based authentication scenario, since it is one of the very also famous, one of the famous authentication mechanisms, easy to implement and less expensive when compared to the, let's say, biometric, for example. Contexts where we will see the authentication is needed and required remotely. You do not have to be appearing physically in an organization in order to be authenticated. No, we can, and we need you to be authenticated remotely. We'll see scenarios for that. First definition. Fundamentals actually related to defining what is an authentication. It is the context of proving your identity. Remember that to prove your identity is the authentication. It means you have to present your ID, and then after you prove it, this is me, but how I prove I am using an authentication tool. So this is the authentication, proving your identity, to give you access to resources at the end of the day. So if you are proved, means you are able to access. If you are approved, means you are able to access resources. Good. of system entity. Yes, exactly. There are two main steps to finish the context of being authenticated, or the authentication. It is to present your ID, then after you prove it. It is to prove your ID, to verify your ID. Thus, the authentication happens. This is not. Remember that we just finished the chapter number 2, which is talking about the cryptography, and amongst of that we talked about the message authentication, the message authentication code, and the message authentication. It is not the same thing. We are not talking about message authentication here. The authentication here is to prove an ID. It's not to secure a message. It's not. So MAC from the chapter number 2, cryptography, message authentication code, is to be generated because of the message authentication, and the message authentication is one level up before upon the cryptography. It means we generate the cipher, and then after we set up a message authentication scenario in order to secure the cipher from being attacked or from being hacked or cracked. So the message authentication, it's not the user authentication. It's not. Two different contexts. Good. Main actors in the context of the authentication. Main actors, main players inside the authentication scenario. We come back to the initial actually technology defined by the NIST, but the actors are claimant, who is asking for an authentication. To be authenticated, it's the claimant. It means you, if you are using, for example, the EduWave, you present your ID, username, and password. So you are claimant. You are claimant. You are asking to be authenticated. The EduWave itself, the system, to verify your username and your password, is the verifier. If he is a system, or if he is a person, or if he's a camera, or whatever he is, since he's doing the approval, he's given or he's denying, both proven or denying the request of the claimant, so he is a verifier. The example of the EduWave itself, regardless. The verifier stands in front of, not behind, but behind of the verifier. There is a reliant party that gives the list of policies, the politics, the rules, the let's say permissions and denials, which is said to be a reliant party, and this is an engine that runs behind the verifier to help the verifier finish his job. So we have a claimant, we have a verifier, and we have a back-end engine that runs to help the verifier decide whether to accept or to deny a claimant. To be claimant and to be claimant and verify the claimant and to be actually registered, you have to be verified by a registration authority. The registration authority actually gives you, as a claimant, as a user, as an end user, the chance to be registered with the engine in order to have a record or a recording inside or with the reliant party. In order later on the verifier tries to verify you, he will say yes, you are verified. So the registration authority is the engine. Come on. The registration authority is the party that would help you as a claimant to register and have a credential to be verified by the verifier after checking the reliant party. The credential service provider. The credential service provider is another context that it's another, let's say, party. Is something that exists in totally back end of the system, but it would exchange the credentials from the registration party with the relaying party. So we see just a graph in a while. Now I'll show you one graph to make you understand more the context of the authentication, how it is happening, and the main actors. We have the claimant that he is the core of the activity of the authentication. The activity of authentication, the main and the pillar and the core actor is the claimant, the one asking to be subscribed, asking to be registered. the registration authority would register this claimant. His registration means there are credentials to be provided. The registration by the registration of the claimant by the registration authority means there are credentials to be transmitted to the CSP, which are the credential service provider, and those credentials once خلاص saved, they would be shared forth and back with the user, yes. And once the user tries to access the system fully, there is a verifier to check up those credentials, and this verifier would rely on a party, on a relaying party in background. It exists in background, but yes says yes or no says no. Subscriber subscribes. His data, his credentials are stored somewhere in the system, and his stored data is communicated with him himself or with the verifier once needed, after 1 day, after 1 month, after 1 year, after whatever. Whenever he is trying to log in to authenticate himself versus the system, the verifier will do that. Actually, there is an assertion here that would be acting in between the verifier and the relaying party to say, yes, let him pass in. This one will say, yes, let him pass in. You are there. In this context. To be authenticated, there are ways and there are means. Remember those four here that are we are seeing four contexts via which we are authenticated. All of us, all the subjects, they are authenticated versus the objects. You as a user will be authenticated because you know something, or you are authenticated because you possess something, or you are authenticated because you are something, or you are authenticated because you do something. I repeat, you are authenticated versus a system or versus an environment because you know something. For example, you know your password. Yes. Because you possess something, because you possess. For example, you possess your smart card, your bank card, your ATM card, something like that. Possess something. Or because you are something. You have your retina, your eye print, or your fingerprint, or your voice. Not voice, but let's say fingerprint and retina. Your shape, gait, something like that. You are something. Or you do something. For example, you speak like I'm doing now. If your voice is being recognized, yes. Or you act somehow. Your action or your act, if it meets some credentials, so you are authenticated. So either you know, or you possess, or you are, or you do. We can actually, those are means of authentication that we may utilize each of them separately, or we may utilize more than one authentication scenario in order to authenticate you. Yes, we may apply more than one authentication scenario in one system. Absolutely true. And remember, those are scenarios to authenticate users, yes, but they are not the final security scenario. We are not setting up, because of them, we are not raising up the security to 100%. Remember, still, we are raising up the security into a higher level, yes, but it's not 100%. 100% secure system is an isolated system. Isolated system means it's useless. So we are raising up the security one level, but still there are issues. Still there are issues and constraints versus such context. Thank you very much for today. I appreciate your follow-up. If you have any questions, please raise them up now. Otherwise, see you next class.